The billionaire left to protect his wife, but returned and found her in hospital, holding their baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Hayes Medical Technologies executive suite. Dorian Hayes stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his broad shoulders tense beneath his charcoal Tom Ford suit. At 39, he commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. 6'2" with an athletic build maintained through early morning runs and weekend tennis matches, his dark hair, perfectly styled, with just a hint of silver at the temples, caught the light as he turned his head slightly. Steel gray eyes, usually sharp with business acumen, now held a distant, troubled expression. The medical report lay open on his mahogany desk, its clinical language stark against the warm wood grain. Stage 2 lymphoma. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each letter a small betrayal of the body he'd always trusted to carry him through 18-hour workdays and demanding business. Negotiations, Mr. Hayes. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. Professional and concerned, Mrs. Hayes called again. She said dinner is at 7 o'clock, and she's making that salmon dish you love. Dorian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Aurora, his wife of 3 years, with her infectious laugh and the way she wrinkled her nose when she concentrated on her legal briefs. The successful attorney who had built her own practice from scratch, who believed in fighting for justice with the same passion she brought to everything else in her life. The woman who still looked at him like he hung the moon, even after all these years. Tell her I'll be late, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Important client call. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have a call scheduled with Dr. Weyer in Munich, the oncologist whose experimental treatment program offered hope that traditional therapies in the States couldn't match, the treatment that would require months away from everything he'd built, everything he loved. He thought of the conversation they'd had just last weekend, lying in their king-size bed in their Beacon Hill brownstone. Aurora's auburn hair spread across his chest like silk. She'd talked about the nursery they'd designed together, her green eyes bright with dreams of cribs and midnight feedings. I can already picture little feet running down our hallway, she'd whispered, tracing patterns on his skin with her fingertip. The memory felt like a physical blow now. How could he tell her that those dreams might crumble, that he might not be there to see those little feet, to teach their children to ride bikes or walk them down the aisle someday? How could he watch the light dim in her eyes as his own body betrayed them both? Dr. Harrison's words echoed in his mind from that morning's appointment with aggressive treatment. Your prognosis is excellent, but I won't lie to you. It's going to be a fight. You'll need all the support you can get. Support, the word tasted bitter. Dorian had built his empire by protecting what mattered most to him. He'd sheltered Aurora from the ugliness of hostile takeovers, from the pressure that came with being married to a billionaire, from every hardship he could possibly shield her from. The idea of asking her to watch him suffer, to see him weak and vulnerable, to risk her own dreams for his uncertain future. It felt like the cruelest form of selfishness. His phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. Missing you already. Can't wait to hear about your day over dinner. Love you endlessly. The message was accompanied by a photo she'd taken that morning. Herself, in their kitchen wearing his MIT t-shirt that hung loose on her petite frame, coffee mug in hand, sunlight streaming through the windows behind her. Her smile was radiant, unguarded, full of the future she believed they'd shared together. Dorian set the phone down with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. A plan was already forming in his mind, each step calculated with the same precision he brought to billion-dollar acquisitions. If he could beat this thing in Germany, really beat it, he could come back to her whole, healthy, ready to give her everything she deserved. And if he couldn't, well, at least she'd be free to build the life she'd always dreamed of, without the shadow of his illness hanging over her happiness. He picked up his phone and dialed Dr. Weber's number. When the familiar German accent answered, Dorian's voice was resolute. Doctor, I'm ready to begin treatment. How soon can you have me in Munich? As arrangements were made and timelines discussed, Dorian's gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk. Their wedding day, Aurora laughing as he dipped her during their first dance, her white dress flowing around them like captured starlight. Neither of them could have imagined that love would one day require such an impossible sacrifice. He would leave her everything, the house, the accounts, the security she'd never have to worry about again. He'd craft a lie that would hurt her now, but save her from years of potential heartbreak. It was, he told himself, the most loving thing he could do. But as the call ended and silence settled over his office once more, Dorian Hayes, the man who had conquered every challenge the business world could throw at him, felt something he'd never experienced before: the devastating weight of a decision that might destroy the very thing he was trying to protect. What he didn't know was that life had already planted its own surprise, growing quietly within the woman he was preparing to leave behind, a secret that would change everything, even if he wouldn't discover it for months to come. What would you have done in Dorian's position? Told the truth or tried to protect the person you love most? Aurora Castellano Hayes sat at the kitchen island of their Beacon Hill brownstone, her laptop open to a complex contract negotiation, but her attention kept drifting to the untouched salmon dinner growing cold on the marble countertop. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the house like a countdown to something she couldn't name. At 28, Aurora possessed the kind of beauty that commanded attention without trying: porcelain skin that flushed easily when she laughed, long auburn hair that caught light like autumn leaves, and emerald eyes that could dissect a legal argument as easily as they could melt Dorian's defenses. Tonight, those eyes held worry as she traced the rim of her wineglass with one manicured finger, the deep burgundy liquid untouched. Her phone buzzed, finally, but instead of Dorian's name, it was her law partner, Isabel. Still at the office, Isabel's voice carried concern. "You've been working insane hours lately, just waiting for Dorian," Aurora replied, closing her laptop with a soft snap. Another late night for him. Big client call with Germany. Apparently, there was a pause. "Aura, you sound tired. When's the last time you two had a real conversation?" The question hit deeper than intended. Aurora thought of the past few weeks, Dorian's distracted silences during dinner, the way he'd started taking calls in his study with the door closed, the subtle but persistent distance she'd attributed to work stress. "We're fine," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Just busy season." After hanging up, Aurora padded upstairs to their master suite, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The room was exactly as she'd left it that morning: Egyptian cotton sheets still rumpled from sleep, Dorian's cologne lingering in the air, his coffee cup forgotten on the nightstand next to a stack of medical journals she'd assumed were for his company's latest software development. She picked up one of the journals, flipping through pages of oncological research and treatment protocols. Strange reading for a software mogul, but Dorian had always been thorough in understanding the medical field his technology served. The sound of his key in the front door sent relief flooding through her. She hurried downstairs, finding him in the foyer, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. His tie hung loose, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Hey," she said softly, approaching him with the smile that had first caught his attention at a charity gala 3 years ago. "Rough day." Dorian's steel-gray eyes met hers for a moment before looking away. Something like that. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. Distant and carefully controlled, Aurora reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture as natural as breathing after 3 years of marriage. But Dorian stepped back slightly, the movement so subtle she might have imagined it if not for the cold space it created between them. "I saved you dinner," she offered, searching his face for clues to the stranger standing in their foyer. "Your favorite. Thought we could eat together and you could tell me about this German client that's keeping you so busy." "I'm not hungry." The words came out sharper than intended, and she saw him wessy at his own tone. "Sorry, it's been a long day." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Aurora felt something shifting, like the moment before an earthquake, when birds fall silent and the air itself seems to hold its breath. "Dorian, what's going on?" She kept her voice gentle. "You've been different lately, distant. If there's something wrong, nothing's wrong." The lie came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Just business pressures. You know how it is." But she didn't know. In 3 years together, Dorian had never shut her out like this. He'd shared his fears about quarterly reports, his frustrations with board meetings, his excitement about new innovations. This wall he was building felt foreign and impenetrable. Over the next few days, the distance only grew. Dorian left earlier for work and came home later, their usual Sunday morning routine of pancakes and newspaper reading. became a silent affair with him scrolling through his phone while she pretended to read the lifestyle section. Even their physical intimacy changed. His kisses felt like goodbyes. His embraces carried a desperate quality that left her more confused than comforted. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Aurora had planned a romantic dinner, complete with candles and the bottle of wine they'd been saving from their honeymoon in Tuscany. She'd even left work early, something that rarely happened during a major case. Dorian arrived home to find her waiting in an emerald dress that matched her eyes. Her hair swept up in the elegant style he'd once said made her look like a movie star from the golden age of Hollywood. "What's all this?" he asked, but there was no warmth in his voice, only wariness. "I thought we could reconnect," she said, moving to embrace him. "It feels like we're ships passing in the night lately." He allowed the embrace, but didn't return it, his body rigid against hers. "Aurora, we need to talk." The words every wife dreads. She felt her heart begin to race as they sat across from each other at their dining room table. The romantic setting, suddenly feeling like a stage set for a tragedy. "I've been thinking about our future." Dorian began, his businessman's composure firmly in place, "about what we both want from life." "Okay," she said carefully, studying his face for any hint of the man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't think I want children anymore." The statement hit her like a physical blow. They'd talked about children countless times, names they liked, how they'd decorate a nursery, whether their kids would have his eyes or her stubborn streak. It had been one of the cornerstones of their shared future. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Last month, you said you couldn't wait to teach our daughter to ride a bike or take our son to his first baseball game. People changed their minds." His voice was clinical, detached. "I've realized that my career requires more focus than I initially thought. Children would be a distraction." Aurora felt tears threatening, but forced them back. "Since when do you consider family a distraction? Since when do you make major life decisions without discussing them with your wife?" "I'm discussing it now." The coldness in his voice was like nothing she'd ever heard from him. This wasn't the man who'd held her during thunderstorms, who'd surprised her with handwritten love notes, who'd once driven for hours just to bring her soup when she had the flu. "Dorian, what is really going on here?" Her legal training kicked in, the instinct to dig for truth overriding her emotional devastation. "This isn't about career focus. You're lying to me." For a moment, she saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of pain in his eyes that was quickly suppressed. "I'm not lying. I'm being honest about what I want from my life. And it's not this." He gestured vaguely at the romantic dinner, at her, at the life they'd built together. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Aurora sat back in her chair, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had simply vanished. "So, what are you saying exactly?" Dorian's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, the only sign of his internal struggle. "I think we should take a break, sometime apart, to figure out what we both really want." "A break," she repeated the words numbly. "You want to separate. It's for the best." "Best for whom?" He didn't answer, and in that silence, Aurora felt her marriage crumbling around her like a house of cards caught in a sudden wind. The future she'd imagined, their children's laughter filling these rooms, growing old together, building something beautiful and lasting, vanished in an instant. What she didn't know was that even as her heart shattered, new life was already growing within her, a secret that would soon change everything. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of their bedroom, casting ethereal patterns across the unmade bed. Aurora hadn't slept. She'd spent the night curled on her side of the mattress, listening to Dorian's restless movements, the way he'd gotten up 3 times to pace the hallway, the soft sound of him making coffee at 4 a.m. now. She watched him pack, not the casual overnight bag he took on business trips, but the large leather suitcase his mother had given him for their first anniversary. He moved with mechanical precision, folding shirts with military corners, arranging toiletries in neat rows. Each item placed felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. "How long?" she asked, her voice from the tears she'd finally allowed herself to cry in the shower. Dorian's hand stilled on a stack of sweaters. "I don't know." "That's not an answer." Aurora sat up in bed, pulling the silk sheet around her like armor. "A week, a month? Are you planning to come back at all? Or should I call my lawyer now?" The mention of divorce made him flinch visibly. "Aurora, please, this isn't what I want." "Then don't do it." She scrambled to her knees, desperation making her voice crack. "Whatever this is about, we can work through it. That's what marriage means, Dorian. We face things together." He turned away from her, focusing intently on zipping the suitcase. "Some things are better faced alone." "Like what?" "What could possibly be so terrible that you'd rather destroy our marriage than tell me the truth?" For a moment, She thought he might break. His shoulders sagged, and she could see the internal war playing out in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the suitcase handle until his knuckles went white. But then the mask slipped back into place, and when he faced her again, his expression was carefully neutral. "I've already transferred money to your account," he said, as if discussing a business transaction. "Enough to cover the house, your expenses, whatever you need. The deed to the brownstone is in your name now. You won't have to worry about anything financial." The clinical nature of his words felt like slaps. "I don't want your money, Dorian. I want my husband back. This is who I am now." Aurora studied his face, the sharp cheekbones she'd traced with her fingertips countless times, the mouth that had whispered promises and declarations of forever, the gray eyes that had once looked at her like she was his entire world. Now those eyes held nothing but carefully constructed emptiness. "I don't believe you," she whispered. "The man I married wouldn't abandon his family like this. He wouldn't run when things got difficult. Maybe you never really knew me at all." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Aurora fell back against the pillows, feeling as if he'd reached into her chest and squeezed her heart until it stopped beating. Dorian picked up his suitcase and walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. For a heartbeat, Aurora thought he might turn around, might drop the pretense, and tell her what was really happening. Instead, he spoke without looking at her. "I'm sorry, Aurora, for all of it." And then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of his cologne and the echo of 3 years of shared dreams crumbling into dust. Aurora heard his car start in the driveway, the sound of the engine fading as he drove away from the life they'd built together. She pulled the covers over her head and let herself break completely, sobbing until her chest ached and her throat was raw. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of legal consultations, concerned calls from friends, and sleepless nights spent staring at her phone, hoping for a text that never came. Aurora threw herself into work with the single-minded focus of someone trying to outrun their own thoughts. She took on new cases, worked 18-hour days, and ignored the worried looks from Isabel and the rest of her team. It was 3 weeks after Dorian left that her world tilted again. Aurora sat in Dr. Martinez's office staring at the ultrasound image in her trembling hands. The black and white swirls resolved into something unmistakably human, a tiny form with an oversized head and delicate limbs floating in the protective darkness of her womb. "Based on the measurements, I'd say you're about 6 weeks along," Dr. Martinez said gently, her kind eyes taking in Aurora's shell-shocked expression. "This would put conception around, let me see." She consulted her calendar. Mid-February. 2 weeks before Dorian's sudden personality change. 2 weeks before their marriage imploded. Aurora's hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach, where their child was growing, completely unaware that their father had walked away before he even knew they existed. "Are you all right, dear?" Dr. Martinez asked, noting Aurora's pulse. "I know unplanned pregnancies can be overwhelming, but it wasn't unplanned," Aurora interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wanted this. We've been trying for months." The past tense felt like swallowing glass. Dr. Martinez's expression softened with understanding. "And your husband, how is he taking the news?" Aurora looked down at the ultrasound again, at the miracle she dreamed of sharing with the man who'd promised to love her forever. "He doesn't know yet." That night, Aurora sat in their empty house. Her house now, according to the papers Dorian's lawyer had delivered, holding the ultrasound photo like a lifeline. She'd called his office, but his assistant said he was unavailable indefinitely. She'd tried his cell phone dozens of times, but it went straight to voicemail. She'd even swallowed her pride and called his mother in Connecticut, but Helen Hayes claimed she hadn't heard from her son either. It was as if Dorian had simply vanished from the earth, leaving behind only the devastating wreckage of their marriage and a bank account that felt more like blood money than support. Aurora placed the ultrasound on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time, their baby growing inside her, while she grieved the loss of the man she'd thought she'd spend forever with. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was carrying the child they'd both wanted so desperately, but she was facing the future as a single mother. She picked up her phone and dialed Dorian's number one more time, listening to it ring before his voicemail picked up. His recorded voice, warm and familiar, felt like a ghost reaching across an impossible distance. "Hi, you've reached Dorian Hayes. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." After the beep, Aurora took a shaking breath. "Dorian, it's me. I know you said you didn't want children, but there's something you need to know." Something that changes everything. Please call me back. Please. She hung up and waited, staring at her phone as minutes stretched into hours. But the call never came. And slowly, Aurora began to accept that she would be facing motherhood alone, carrying the secret of their child. Like a beacon of hope in the darkness her husband had left behind, what she didn't know was that thousands of miles away, Dorian was fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room in Munich. Her voicemail playing on repeat in his mind as poison coursed through his veins, killing the cancer that was trying to steal his future with her. 5 months had passed since Dorian's departure, and Aurora's body now carried the unmistakable curve of pregnancy beneath her flowing maternity dresses. She stood in what had once been their guest room, now transformed into a nursery painted in soft yellow. Gender neutral, she'd told the painter, though she knew from her recent ultrasound that she was carrying a boy. The crib stood assembled in the corner, a testament to her stubborn independence. She'd put it together herself on a Saturday afternoon, following the incomprehensible instructions with the same methodical approach she brought to complex legal cases. Her back had ached for days afterward, but the accomplishment had felt necessary, symbolic even. She was doing this alone, and she was strong enough to handle it. "You've outdone yourself," Isabel said from the doorway, her arms full of gift bags from the impromptu baby shower their law firm had thrown. "Though I still think you should have let Vincent help with that crib," he offered like 6 times. Aurora smoothed her hand over her rounded belly, feeling a responsive flutter from within. "I needed to prove I could do it myself." She paused, looking around the cheerful room with its carefully chosen furniture and soft lighting. "He's going to grow up here in this house, and I want him to know that his mother is capable of anything. Even changing diapers at 3 a.m. while running on 2 hours of sleep. Especially that." Aurora managed to smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. The bravado was easier to maintain during daylight hours, surrounded by supportive colleagues and the familiar rhythm of work. It was the nights that tested her resolve, when the silence of the brownstone pressed against her like a living thing, and she found herself talking to the baby just to fill the emptiness. Isabel set down the gifts and studied her friend's face with the sharp perception that made her an excellent litigator. Any word from him? The question that haunted every conversation, every quiet moment. Aurora shook her head, her hand still resting protectively on her belly. "Nothing. It's like he never existed." She'd stopped calling months ago, after the 20th unanswered voicemail had made her feel pathetic rather than determined. "His lawyer handles everything now. Very professional, very cold." What Aurora didn't say was how she'd hired a private investigator, a discreet man named James Rothschild, who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. His report had been frustratingly thin. Dorian had indeed left the country, but beyond that, the trail went cold. It was as if he deliberately erased himself from existence. "Maybe that's for the best," Isabel offered gently. "You're building something beautiful here, for you and the baby. Maybe you don't need him anymore." Aurora nodded, because it was easier than explaining the truth, that she still woke up reaching for him. Still saved interesting news to share before remembering he wasn't there to hear it. That sometimes late at night, she'd catch herself planning how to decorate their house for Christmas, thinking in terms of we before reality crashed back over her. 3,000 meters away, in a private clinic, nestled in the Bavarian countryside, Dorian Hayes stared out at snow-covered mountains while poison dripped into his veins through an IV port. The chemotherapy had stolen his hair, hollowed his cheeks, and left him weak as a newborn. But the latest scans showed what Dr. Weber cautiously termed encouraging progress. "The tumors have shrunk considerably," the oncologist said, reviewing the imaging results on his tablet. "If this trend continues, we're looking at a full recovery. You've responded better to treatment than we dared hope." Dorian closed his eyes, feeling something that might have been relief if it weren't mixed with so much regret. "How much longer?" "Another month, perhaps 2. Then we'll reassess." Dr. Weber's English carried only a slight accent, refined from years of treating international patients. "You're fortunate, Mr. Hayes. Not everyone responds this well to our protocols." Fortunate, the word felt hollow in the sterile treatment room where Dorian spent 6 hours every Tuesday and Friday, watching the 4 slowly deliver salvation mixed with suffering. He'd thought he was being noble, sparing Aurora the sight of him retching into basins. Too weak to shower without help, reduced to a shadow of the man she'd married. Now, months into treatment with hope finally on the horizon, The nobility felt more like cowardice. His phone, which he'd kept on silent for months, buzzed with a message from Thomas Brennan, the only friend who knew where he was. Thomas had been his roommate at MIT, his best man, the one person Dorian trusted to watch over Aurora from a distance without interfering. "Call me, it's important." Dorian's hands shook slightly, a side effect of the medication. As he dialed, Thomas answered on the first ring. "Jesus, Dorian, finally. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I was in treatment. What's wrong? Is Aurora?" "She's fine. More than fine, actually." Thomas's voice carried a strange mixture of excitement and anger. "Dorian, she's pregnant." The words hit Dorian like a physical blow. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white against the hospital bed rails. "What, about 5 months along from what I can tell? She's showing now, glowing like they say pregnant women do. I saw her at that cafe on Newbury Street last week, the one where you two used to have Sunday brunch. She was with her law partner talking about nursery colors and baby names." Dorian's mind raced, calculating dates, remembering their last night together before everything changed. Before he'd received the diagnosis that had driven him to this desperate plan. They'd made love with the desperate passion of two people trying to conceive, and apparently, "Does she know I know?" Dorian's voice came out as a whisper. "Of course not. You made me promise not to interfere, remember? But Christ, Dorian, she's carrying your child, and she's doing it alone because you decided to play Marty'd hero instead of trusting her to handle the truth." The accusation stung because it was true. Dorian had convinced himself that leaving was the ultimate act of love. But now, imagining Aurora navigating pregnancy alone, he wondered if it had been the ultimate act of selfishness instead. "How does she look?" he asked, hating himself for the question, but unable to stop it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Beautiful, tired, strong, like she's carrying the weight of the world, but determined not to let it crush her." Another pause. "She looks like a woman who's been abandoned by the person she trusted most." The words were a knife between his ribs. Dorian thought of Aurora in there, her house, assembling cribs alone and choosing paint colors without input from the man who should have been there for every doctor's appointment, every flutter of movement, every moment of wonder and fear that pregnancy brought. "I'm getting better," Dorian said suddenly. "The treatment is working. Dr. Weber thinks full recovery is possible." "That's wonderful news. Now, what are you going to do about it?" Dorian looked around the treatment room, at the four-pole that had been his constant companion, at the window that showed a world he'd removed himself from out of fear and misguided protection. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine going home, to imagine Aurora's face when she saw him, to imagine holding his child. "I don't know if she'll forgive me," he admitted. "You'll never know unless you try. But Dorian," Thomas's voice turned serious, "don't wait too long. She's building a life without you. Every day you stay gone makes it harder to find your way back." After hanging up, Dorian sat in the gathering darkness of his hospital room, one hand pressed against his chest where his heart hammered with a mixture of hope and terror. Somewhere across the ocean, Aurora was preparing for the birth of their child, a child who would inherit his eyes, her stubborn streak, and the complicated legacy of a father who'd loved them enough to leave. But maybe, if he was very lucky, not too much to return. The contractions started at 3 o'clock in the morning, on a rain-soaked Tuesday in November. Aurora had been working late in her home office reviewing depositions for a custody case that hit too close to home when the first wave of pain gripped her lower back like an iron fist. She'd known this day was coming, had packed her hospital bag weeks ago, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of labor beginning in the echoing silence of her empty house. No husband to time contractions, no partner to drive her to the hospital when the pain became too intense to ignore. Just her, the baby, and the weight of doing this alone. By dawn, Aurora was in the delivery room at Massachusetts General Hospital, gripping Isabel's hand while Dr. Martinez monitored the baby's heartbeat. The labor had progressed quickly, too quickly, according to the concerned murmurs between the medical staff. "Something's wrong," Aurora gasped between contractions, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. "The baby's heart rate." "Aurora, listen to me, doctor," Martinez said, her voice calm but urgent. "The umbilical cord is wrapped around the baby's neck. We need to do an emergency cesarean right now." The words sent ice through Aurora's veins. She'd imagined many scenarios for her son's birth, but not this. Not the rush of surgical masks and bright lights, not the desperate efficiency of a medical team fighting to save both their lives. "Is he going to be okay?" she whispered as they wheeled her toward the operating room. "Please tell me he's going to be okay. We're going to take excellent care of both of you," Dr. Martinez assured her. But Aurora caught the worried glance she exchanged with the anesthesiologist. The surgery felt both endless and instantaneous. Aurora drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of tugging sensations and muffled voices discussing blood pressure and oxygen levels. Then suddenly, a cry, strong and indignant and absolutely perfect. "It's a boy," someone announced. And Aurora felt tears streaming down her face as she heard her son's first protest at being thrust into the bright cold world. They placed him on her chest for a brief moment, tiny and wrinkled and impossibly beautiful, with a shock of dark hair and unfocused eyes that she somehow knew would turn gray like his father's. Then he was whisked away to be checked and cleaned while Dr. Martinez worked to repair the damage the difficult birth had caused. "He's perfect," the pediatrician assured her later as Aurora held her son properly for the first time. 7 pounds 2 ounces. All his reflexes are normal. His breathing is strong. "You did beautifully, Aurora." Aurora stared down at the baby nestled against her chest, marveling at his perfect tiny fingers, the way his rosebud mouth moved in his sleep, the impossible softness of his skin. "Hello, Gabriel," she whispered, testing out the name she'd chosen months ago, Gabriel Hayes, because even though his father had abandoned them, the baby deserved to carry that connection. "He looks just like you described, Dorian," Isabel said softly from her chair beside the hospital bed. "The strong jaw, the way he furrows his brow when he sleeps." Aurora's heart clenched at the observation. Gabriel did look like his father would grow up with Dorian's features as a constant reminder of the man who'd walked away. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the miracle in her arms. The first few days passed in a blur of feeding schedules and learning to change diapers with surgical stitches pulling at her abdomen. Aurora had expected the recovery to be difficult, but the pain that gripped her side 3 days after Gabriel's birth was different, sharper, more urgent. "It's likely an infection," Dr. Martinez explained after examining her. "Sometimes the incision site doesn't heal as cleanly as we'd like. We're going to keep you here for a few more days, monitor you closely, but Gabriel is fine. He can stay with you, of course. We just need to make sure you're healing properly." What should have been a quick recovery stretched into a week, then 10 days. Aurora's body seemed determined to fight the healing process, her incision becoming inflamed despite antibiotics, her pain levels spiking when she tried to do too much too soon. "You need to rest," Isabel insisted, watching Aurora try to pace the hospital room while Gabriel slept in his bassinet. "Let your body heal. Let the nurses help." "I can't," Aurora said, her voice tight with exhaustion and frustration. "I'm his mother. I'm supposed to take care of him, not lie here useless, while other people—" "You're not useless. You're recovering from major surgery while caring for a newborn. Give yourself some grace." But grace felt like a luxury Aurora couldn't afford. Every day in the hospital was another day of mounting bills despite the insurance, another day away from work, though her partners had assured her the firm would survive her absence, another day of feeling like she was failing at the one thing that mattered most, being Gabriel's mother. 3,000 miles away, Dorian stood in Dr. Weber's office, staring at scanned results that showed no trace of cancer in his system. 6 months of treatment had achieved what they'd barely dared hope for, complete remission. "You're free to go home, Mr. Hayes," Dr. Weber said, with the satisfaction of a man who'd helped perform a minor miracle. "Continue with the medication regimen for another month. But as far as I'm concerned, you've beaten this thing." Dorian should have felt elated. Instead, he felt hollow, as if the victory had come too late to matter. "What are the chances of recurrence?" "Less than 5% given your response to treatment. You're going to live a long, healthy life." Dr. Weber paused, studying Dorian's expression. "You don't seem pleased by this news." "I am. It's just," Dorian struggled to put his feelings into words, "there's a lot I need to make right." That evening, Dorian sat in his temporary apartment overlooking the Rhine, holding his phone like a loaded weapon. Thomas's latest update had been brief but devastating. Aurora had given birth to their son 2 months ago, but there had been complications. She was still in the hospital, struggling with post-surgical infections while caring for a newborn alone. Their son, Dorian, closed his eyes, trying to imagine the child who carried his DNA but would grow up without knowing his father's voice, his laugh, The stories Dorian had planned to tell him about his grandfather's immigrant journey and his grandmother's strength. He'd convinced himself that staying away was noble, that returning healthy would somehow erase the months of abandonment. But now, picturing Aurora in a hospital bed, exhausted and in pain while their baby cried in her arms, Dorian realized the magnitude of his mistake. She didn't need a healthy stranger appearing in her life with explanations and apologies. She needed the partner who should have been there all along, holding her hand through labor, learning to change diapers, sharing the profound terror and joy of becoming parents together. Dorian picked up his phone and for the first time in 10 months dialed Aurora's number. It went straight to voicemail. Her phone was probably dead or forgotten in the chaos of new motherhood. But this time, instead of hanging up, he left a message. "Aurora, it's me. I know I have no right to call after all this time, but I heard about the baby, about Gabriel." His voice broke on their son's name. "I'm coming home. I know you probably don't want to see me. And I understand if you never forgive me for leaving, but I'm coming home. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this right. I love you. I never stopped loving you." He hung up and booked the first flight to Boston, his hands shaking as he typed in his credit card information. Outside his window, the Rhine flowed steadily toward distant seas, carrying his reflection toward a future he could only hope he wasn't too late to reclaim. The fluorescent lights of Massachusetts General Hospital buzzed overhead as Dorian walked down the maternity ward corridor, his dress shoes clicking against the polished linoleum with each deliberate step. He'd flown through the night, landing at Logan Airport as dawn broke over Boston Harbor, and had come straight here without stopping at a hotel or even changing clothes. His reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors showed the toll of the past 10 months. He was leaner now, his face more angular, his dark hair shorter than Aurora had ever seen. Its expensive suit hung differently on his frame, tailored for a man who no longer existed. But his eyes, those steel gray eyes that Aurora had once said could see straight through to her soul, burned with a determination that had carried him through months of chemotherapy and across an ocean. Room 412. The number Thomas had given him seemed to pulse like a heartbeat as he approached. Through the partially open door, he could hear a soft voice singing. Aurora's voice, though it was different now, gentler somehow, wrapped around a lullaby he didn't recognize. Dorian paused at the threshold, his hand raised to knock, and caught his first glimpse of his son. Gabriel was tiny, impossibly small, nestled against Aurora's chest as she swayed gently beside the hospital bed. Dark hair crowned his perfect head, and even from this distance, Dorian could see the strong line of his jaw, the way his little fist curled with determined strength. His son, the child he dreamed of, feared for, and abandoned before he was even born. Aurora wore a simple hospital gown, her auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow made her look both exhausted and radiant. There were shadows under her emerald eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and pain medication. But as she looked down at Gabriel, her face held a serenity Dorian had never seen before, the profound peace of a mother completely devoted to her child. For a moment, he simply watched them, this perfect tableau of the family he'd walked away from, the family he'd convinced himself he was protecting by leaving. The sight of them together, so complete, so self-contained, made him wonder if he'd been wrong to come back at all. Then Aurora's head turned toward the doorway, perhaps sensing his presence, and their eyes met for the first time in 10 months. The lullaby died on her lips. Gabriel stirred in her arms, making a small sound of protest at the sudden stillness. Aurora's face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been hope, and then a wall of protective anger that transformed her features into a mask Dorian didn't recognize. "Hello, Aurora," he said quietly, his voice rougher than he'd intended. She didn't respond immediately, just stood there holding their son, her body positioned as if she might need to shield Gabriel from whatever threat Dorian represented. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "You're not supposed to be here. I know." Dorian stepped into the room, moving slowly, his hands visible and unthreatening. "I know I'm the last person you want to see right now. Actually, you're not even on the list of people I want to see." Aurora's grip on Gabriel tightened protectively. "You gave up that right when you walked out on your pregnant wife." The words hit him like physical blows, but Dorian absorbed them, knowing he deserved far worse. "Aurora, please let me explain." Explain. Her voice rose slightly, causing Gabriel to fuss. She immediately lowered it, but the fury remained. Explain how you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. How you concluded that I was too weak to handle whatever crisis made you run. Or maybe you'd like to explain how you left me to give birth to our son alone while you, Dorian, found yourself, had a midlife crisis, decided you preferred a life without responsibilities. Each accusation was a knife twist, made worse by the fact that she was partially right. He had thought her too fragile to handle his illness, had decided unilaterally what she could and couldn't cope with. The arrogance of it, viewed from this sterile hospital room, where she'd fought for both their lives while he was an ocean away, was staggering. It wasn't about you not being strong enough, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was about me not being brave enough. Aurora's eyebrows rose in disbelief. Brave enough for what? Dorian looked at his son, really looked at him, taking in every perfect detail. Gabriel had fallen back asleep against Aurora's chest, his tiny face, peaceful and trusting. The sight gave Dorian the courage he'd been lacking for months. To tell you I had cancer. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that seemed to change the very air between them. Aurora's face went white, her grip on Gabriel instinctively tightening, as if she could protect him from this revelation retroactively. What? She breathed. Lymphoma stage 2? Dorian's hands shook as he spoke, the words feeling foreign after months of secrecy. I found out the day before I started acting differently. The day I came home late and couldn't eat dinner, couldn't touch you without thinking about what it would do to you if I died. Aurora sank slowly into the chair beside her hospital bed, never loosening her hold on Gabriel. Cancer, she repeated as if testing the word's weight. The doctors here gave me good odds. But there was an experimental treatment in Germany, better success rates, faster recovery times. I thought. Dorian ran a hand through his hair, the gesture achingly familiar to Aurora despite everything that had changed. I thought if I could beat it there, I could come back to you whole, healthy, ready to give you the life we'd planned. So, you decided to lie to me instead. Aurora's voice was deadly quiet. You decided to break my heart and abandon me rather than trust me to handle the truth. I was trying to protect you. From what? From being there when you needed me most. From fulfilling my marriage vows about sickness and health. Tears began to track down Aurora's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. You robbed me of the chance to fight for you, Dorian. You robbed me of the chance to support my husband through the scariest time of his life. And you robbed our son of having his father there from the beginning. The truth of her words hit Dorian like a physical assault. He'd been so focused on the potential pain of watching him suffer that he'd inflicted a different, deeper wound. The agony of abandonment, of feeling unloved and unwanted at the moment she needed him most. Did the treatment work? Aurora asked suddenly, her legal mind cutting through emotion to the facts. Yes, full remission. Dr. Weber says the chances of recurrence are minimal. She nodded slowly, processing this information. So, you're healthy now, and you came back because I love you, because I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, because I made the biggest mistake of my life when I walked away, and I'm hoping, praying, that it's not too late to make it right. Aurora was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Gabriel's sleeping face. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with exhaustion and pain. He looks like you, she said simply. Everyone says so. Your eyes, your jawline, even the way he furrows his brow when he's thinking. And every time someone mentions it, it's like a knife in my chest, because you weren't here to see it for yourself. Dorian felt tears he'd been holding back for months finally break free. Aurora, I went through 47 hours of labor alone, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I had an emergency cesarean because the cord was wrapped around his neck. I thought I might lose him, and I had no one to hold my hand or tell me it was going to be okay. Then I developed an infection that kept us here for 2 weeks, and I've been taking care of a newborn while recovering from major surgery, because the man who promised to love me forever decided I was too delicate to handle his problems. The litany of his failures hung in the air between them like an accusation that could never be fully answered. Dorian wanted to go to her, to drop to his knees and beg for forgiveness, but he could see the invisible barrier she'd erected around herself and their son. What do you want from me, Dorian? Aurora asked finally. What do you expect to happen now that you've walked back into our lives, with your explanations and your apologies? It was the question he'd been asking himself for the entire flight from Munich. What did he want? What did he have the right to ask for? I want to be Gabriel's father, he said quietly. I want to hold my son and tell him stories and teach him to ride a bike. I want to take care of you while you recover, to make up for not being here when you needed me most." He paused, gathering courage for the most important words he'd ever spoken. "And if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'll never abandon our family again." Aurora studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he hoped she could find. Finally, she stood up, still holding Gabriel, and moved toward him. For a heartbeat, Dorian thought she might forgive him, might let him hold his son. Instead, she stopped just out of reach and spoke words that shattered his heart all over again. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Dorian. You made a choice that broke us, and I don't know if we can ever be put back together." The silence that followed Aurora's devastating words stretched between them like a chasm. Gabriel stirred in his mother's arms, his tiny face scrunching up in preparation for what Aurora had learned to recognize as his hungry cry. The sound broke through the tension, reminding them both that whatever lay between them, this innocent child had needs that transcended their complicated history. "He needs to eat," Aurora said quietly, moving toward the small refrigerator where the nurses stored her pumped breast milk. But as she shifted Gabriel to one arm to open the door, a sharp pain shot through her incision site, causing her to gasp and nearly stumble. Dorian moved instinctively, his hands reaching out to steady her. "Let me help. I can manage," Aurora said through gritted teeth. But another wave of pain contradicted her words. "Aurora, you're clearly in pain. Please let me at least." Dorian reached for the refrigerator door, his movements careful and non-threatening. "You shouldn't be straining yourself." For a moment, she looked like she might refuse on principle. But Gabriel's cries were growing more insistent, and the exhaustion etched in every line of her body was impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, she allowed Dorian to retrieve the bottle and warm it under the hot water tap. "Here," he said softly, holding out the bottle. "Is the temperature right?" Aurora tested it against her wrist, emotion so naturally maternal that it made Dorian's chest ache with all the moments he'd missed. "It's fine," she admitted grudgingly. As she settled back into the chair to feed Gabriel, Dorian found himself mesmerized by the sight of his son. Gabriel latched onto the bottle with determined enthusiasm, his tiny hands waving in the air before settling against the bottle's sides. His eyes, when they opened briefly, were indeed the same, steel gray, as Dorian's own. "He's beautiful," Dorian whispered, the words inadequate for the overwhelming rush of love and regret that crashed over him. "He's perfect." "He is." Aurora's voice softened as she looked down at Gabriel, her anger momentarily eclipsed by maternal pride. "He's been such a good baby considering everything. The nurses say he's remarkably alert for his age." Dorian pulled a chair closer, not close enough to intrude, but near enough to really see his son. "What's he like? His personality, I mean?" The questions seemed to catch Aurora off guard, as if she hadn't expected him to be interested in the details. "He's determined. When he wants something, he makes sure you know it. But he's also incredibly observant. Sometimes I catch him just watching everything around him like he's trying to figure out how the world works." "He gets that from you," Dorian said with a small smile. "You always did that, study everything before making your move." Aurora glanced at him sharply, as if the casual intimacy of the observation was unwelcome. But there was something else in her expression too, a flicker of the connection they'd once shared, quickly suppressed, but not quite fast enough to hide. Gabriel finished his bottle and immediately began the fussy movements that Aurora had learned meant he needed to burp. She lifted him to her shoulder, but the motion clearly caused her discomfort. "May I?" Dorian asked hesitantly, gesturing toward Gabriel. "I know I don't have any right to ask, but you're in pain, and he needs." Aurora studied his face for a long moment, clearly wearing with herself. Finally, she nodded curtly. "Support his head. He's still building his neck strength." The transfer of Gabriel from Aurora's arms to Dorian's happened slowly, carefully, with both parents holding their breath. The moment Gabriel's small weight settled against Dorian's chest, the world seemed to shift on its axis. This was his son, his child. The tiny human being he'd helped create carried half his DNA, would inherit his laugh, might someday have his stubborn streak, or his analytical mind. Gabriel squirmed against Dorian's shoulder, then seemed to settle, as if recognizing something familiar in this stranger's touch. Dorian began the gentle patting motion he'd seen Aurora use, his large hand covering nearly half of Gabriel's tiny back. "Like this?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Aurora nodded, watching the interaction with an expression that was carefully neutral, but not entirely successful at hiding her own emotional response. "He likes it when you rub small circles, not just pat." Dorian adjusted his technique, marveling at how Gabriel seemed to relax further into his arms. When the burp finally came, a surprisingly robust sound from such a small person, both parents laughed despite themselves, the tension breaking for just a moment. "He's strong," Dorian observed, feeling Gabriel's grip on his finger. "Look at that hold. The pediatrician says he's developing ahead of schedule. He's already tracking movement with his eyes. And yesterday he held his head up for almost 30 seconds during tummy time." Aurora's pride was evident. The professional accomplishments that had once defined her now secondary to these small but momentous milestones. Dorian looked down at Gabriel, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, tiny lips slightly parted in the trusting way of infants. The weight of what he'd missed, the first smile, the first time Gabriel had slept through the night, countless feedings and diaper changes and quiet moments of bonding settled over him like a physical burden. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words directed as much to Gabriel as to Aurora. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here for any of this." Aurora was quiet for a long moment, watching her son sleep peacefully in his father's arms. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but not without compassion. "He needs a father, Dorian. Despite everything that's happened between us, Gabriel deserves to have you in his life. But I need you to understand something." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Trust isn't just something you can ask for and receive. It has to be earned back piece by piece, choice by choice. And right now, I don't know if you're capable of that kind of commitment." "I am," Dorian said immediately, then caught himself. I want to be. I know I have to prove that to you." "It's not just about wanting to be Dorian. It's about being willing to stay when things get difficult. About choosing us even when it's scary or inconvenient or not what you planned." Aurora's voice grew stronger, more certain. "You left once because you thought you were protecting me. What happens the next time you decide you know what's best for our family without consulting me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dorian knew that his answer would set the tone for whatever chance they might have at rebuilding their relationship. "You're right," he said. "Finally, I made decisions about our life, our family, without giving you a voice in them. I treated you like someone who needed protection, instead of like my partner, my equal." He looked down at Gabriel, then back at Aurora. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again, but I can promise that I'll never make decisions about our family without you again. No matter how scared I am, no matter what I'm facing." Aurora studied his face, searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "Pretty words, Dorian, but words are easy. Actions are what matter." "Then let me show you," he said urgently. "Let me prove to you that I'm not the same man who walked away. Let me earn back your trust, day by day, decision by decision." Aurora was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between Dorian's face and Gabriel's sleeping form. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm being discharged tomorrow. The infection has cleared enough that I can recover at home." She paused, clearly struggling with what she was about to say. "If you want to be Gabriel's father, you can visit, supervised visits during the day while I'm there." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a chance, a small, tentative opening in the wall she'd built around her heart. Dorian felt something that might have been hope unfurl in his chest. "Thank you," he said simply, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Don't thank me yet," Aurora replied, taking Gabriel back from his arms with practiced ease. "Proving you've changed is going to be a lot harder than talking about it." As Dorian watched her settle Gabriel back into his bassinet, he realized she was absolutely right. But for the first time since he'd received his diagnosis nearly a year ago, he felt truly ready for the fight ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Aurora returned home from the hospital, and Dorian had kept his word about the supervised visits. Every morning at 10 o'clock, he arrived at the brownstone with coffee from Aurora's favorite cafe on New Street, the same place where Thomas had spotted her during her pregnancy, and spent 2 hours learning to be Gabriel's father under Aurora's watchful eye. Aurora had expected awkwardness, perhaps even incompetence, from a man who'd built his fortune in boardrooms rather than nurseries. Instead, she found herself watching Dorian transform into someone she barely recognized, patient where he'd once been demanding, gentle where he'd once been forceful, completely focused on Gabriel's needs rather than his own discomfort with the unfamiliar. "You're getting good at that," Aurora observed from her position on the living room sofa, where she was finally able to sit comfortably without wincing. She watched Dorian change Gabriel's diaper with the methodical precision he'd once applied to complex business negotiations. "YouTube University," Dorian admitted with a self-deprecating smile, fastening the diaper tabs with careful attention to symmetry. I've watched approximately 47 videos on infant care in the past month. Did you know there's an entire debate about whether you should wipe front to back or in circles? Despite herself, Aurora felt her lips twitch with the ghost of a smile. What did you conclude? Front to back, obviously. You always said I was good at research. He lifted Gabriel from the changing table, supporting his head with the natural ease that had surprised them both. Though I have to admit, the theory is much simpler than the practice. When you have a target that moves and aims. This time, Aurora did smile, a real one that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd returned. Dorian felt something in his chest loosen at the sight. Hope, maybe, or the memory of how they used to be able to make each other laugh. Gabriel, as if sensing the lighter mood, chose that moment to spit up directly onto Dorian's expensive cashmere sweater. Instead of the frustrated reaction Aurora half expected, Dorian simply reached for the burp cloth he'd learned to keep perpetually within reach. Good timing, buddy, he said mildly, cleaning Gabriel's face with gentle strokes. Remind me to change before my board meeting this afternoon. You have a board meeting? Aurora asked, something that might have been concern flickering across her face. Don't you need to prepare, review reports, rehearse presentations? Dorian shook his head, settling into the rocking chair they'd bought, but never used before Gabriel's birth. I'm learning to delegate better. Turns out, the company runs just fine, without my constant micromanagement. He looked up at Aurora with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. I'm learning that some things are more important than quarterly projections. The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of how completely his priorities had shifted. Aurora studied his face, looking for signs of resentment or restlessness, but found only contentment as he settled Gabriel against his chest for a nap. Dorian, she began, then stopped herself. The question she wanted to ask felt too dangerous, too likely to shatter the fragile peace they'd built. What is it? Nothing. It's just she struggled with how to voice her fear. This is all very new for you. The routine, the mess, the complete unpredictability of life with a baby. I just wonder if you really understand what you're signing up for. Dorian was quiet for a moment, his hand making gentle circles on Gabriel's back. You're asking if I'll run again when things get difficult. Aurora nodded, not trusting her voice. I asked myself the same question, Dorian admitted. Every day for the past 3 weeks, actually, and every day the answer becomes clearer. He looked down at Gabriel, who had fallen asleep to the rhythm of his father's heartbeat. I can't promise I'll never be scared again, Aurora. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes. But I can promise that running isn't an option anymore. Not from this. Not from him. His eyes met hers across the room. Not from you. Before Aurora could respond, Gabriel began to stir restlessly, his peaceful expression shifting to one of discomfort. Within seconds, he was crying, not his usual hungry or wet cry, but something different, sharper, more distressed. What's wrong with him? Dorian asked, his newly acquired confidence evaporating as Gabriel's cries escalated to screams. Aurora was on her feet immediately, moving faster than she had since the surgery. Something's not right, she said, taking Gabriel from Dorian's arms. But instead of calming in his mother's embrace, Gabriel continued to scream, his tiny body rigid with distress. His forehead feels warm, Aurora said, her voice tight with worry. He's burning up. Dorian was already reaching for his phone. Should I call Dr. Martinez? Call 911, Aurora said, her legal training in crisis management taking over even as maternal panic clawed at her chest. Infants can spike dangerous fevers very quickly. The next hour passed in a blur of sirens, medical equipment, and the sterile urgency of Massachusetts General's emergency room. Gabriel's temperature had reached 103, dangerously high for it to hold, and the medical team moved with the swift efficiency that Aurora remembered from his birth. We need to run some tests, the emergency pediatrician explained as nurses worked to establish an IV line in Gabriel's tiny arm. Fever in infants this young can indicate serious bacterial infections. We'll need blood work, urine cultures, possibly a spinal tap to rule out meningitis. The word meningitis hit Aurora like a physical blow. She gripped the bed rail until her knuckles went white, watching helplessly as her son screamed through procedure after procedure. I can't do this, she whispered, her composure finally cracking. I can't watch them hurt him. Without thinking, Dorian moved to her side, his arms sliding around her shoulders. For a moment, Aurora tensed, but then Gabriel let out another heartbroken cry, and her defenses crumbled completely. She turned into Dorian's chest, allowing herself to be held while their son fought whatever was attacking his tiny system. "He's going to be okay," Dorian murmured into her hair, his own voice shaking. "He's strong. Look how strong he is." They stayed like that through the endless hours of waiting, Aurora's anger and mistrust temporarily suspended in the face of their shared terror. When Gabriel's fever finally broke near dawn, when the tests came back showing a simple viral infection rather than the bacterial nightmare they'd feared, Aurora realized something had shifted between them again. "Thank you," she said quietly, as they sat beside Gabriel's hospital crib, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in 12 hours. "For what? For staying, for not falling apart when I did, for being exactly what Gabriel needed." She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "For being exactly what I needed." Dorian reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. "I meant what I said before," he told her. "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever comes next, sleepless nights, teething, temper tantrums, teenage rebellion, I'm staying." Aurora studied their joined hands, then looked up at his face. For the first time since he'd walked back into her life, she allowed herself to see not the man who had abandoned her, but the man who had spent the last 18 hours proving he was someone different entirely. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "So am I," Dorian replied, "but maybe we can be scared together this time." In the pale morning light filtering through the hospital windows with their son breathing steadily beside them, and their hands clasped between their chairs, it felt like the beginning of something new, not a return to what they'd lost, but the tentative first steps toward what they might become. 2 months had passed since Gabriel's fever scare, and the rhythm of their unconventional family had evolved into something neither Aurora nor Dorian had expected. What began as supervised visits had gradually expanded, Dorian staying for lunch, helping with bedtime routines, even spending entire Saturdays learning to navigate the delicate balance of infant care and Aurora's continued recovery. On this particular evening, Aurora found herself watching Dorian read to Gabriel from the leather-bound copy of Guten, Night Moon his mother had sent from Connecticut. Gabriel, now 4 months old and increasingly alert, seemed mesmerized by his father's deep voice, his tiny hands reaching toward the colorful illustrations. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon. Dorian read, his voice soft and rhythmic. He'd long since abandoned the stiff formality that had once defined him, trading expensive suits for jeans and sweaters that could survive inevitable spit-up incidents. Aurora curled deeper into the corner of the sofa, a cup of tea warming her hands as she observed this scene that had become precious in its ordinary beauty. The man reading to their son bore little resemblance to the distant stranger who had walked out of their marriage 11 months ago. This version of Dorian moved with patient gentleness, spoke in hushed tones that respected Gabriel's drowsy state, and seemed completely content to spend his evening in a nursery instead of a boardroom. "Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere." Dorian finished closing the book softly. Gabriel's eyelids were heavy, his small body relaxed against his father's chest. "He's asleep," Aurora whispered. Dorian nodded, rising carefully from the rocking chair and moving toward the crib with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to navigate parenthood through repetition and dedication. He lowered Gabriel onto the mattress with infinite care, covering him with the soft blue blanket Aurora's mother had knitted before his birth. They stood together beside the crib for a moment, watching their son sleep, both lost in the quiet wonder that still caught them off guard. Gabriel's face and sleep was peaceful and perfect, his dark lashes casting shadows on his cheeks, one tiny fist curled beside his face. "He's gotten so much bigger," Dorian murmured, reaching out to gently touch Gabriel's hand. "Look at those fingers. They're actually proportional now." Aurora smiled, remembering her own amazement at how quickly infants changed. "Dr. Martinez says he's in the 90th percentile for both height and weight. She thinks he's going to be tall like you. Good thing you bought those clothes in bigger sizes." Dorian's voice carried a warmth that made something flutter in Aurora's chest, the kind of intimate observation that came from paying attention, from being present for the small details that made up daily life with a baby. They moved quietly out of the nursery, leaving the door slightly ajar so they could hear if Gabriel woke. In the living room, Aurora settled back onto the sofa, while Dorian moved toward the kitchen with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd learned the landscape of this house again. "More tea?" he asked, already reaching for the kettle. Aurora nodded, studying his profile as he prepared her drink exactly the way she liked it, honey instead of sugar, steeped for precisely 4 minutes. When had he relearned these small preferences? When had she stopped noticing him, learning them? Dorian, she said when he returned with 2 steaming mugs, settling into the armchair across from her, with the careful distance he'd maintained since that night at the hospital. Can I ask you something? Of course. Aurora wrapped her hands around her mug, gathering courage for a conversation they'd been dancing around for weeks. What happens now with us? I mean, we found this rhythm with Gabriel and it's working, but we've never talked about what we're actually doing here. Dorian sat down his tea, his expression growing serious. What do you want to happen? That's not an answer. It's an honest question. Dorian leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight. Aurora, I know what I want. I've known since the moment I saw you holding Gabriel in that hospital room. But what I want doesn't matter unless you want it too. Aurora felt her heart begin to race. Tell me anyway. Dorian was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. I want to come home, he said finally. Not to the house, though I miss it, but to you, to us. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know that whatever challenges we're facing them together. I want to be Gabriel's father and your husband, not just a visitor in my own family. The words hung between them like a bridge. Aurora wasn't sure she was ready to cross. And what makes you think that's possible after everything that's happened? Because I'm not the same man who left you. Dorian's voice grew stronger, more certain. That man was so terrified of appearing weak that he forgot what real strength looked like. He thought protection meant making decisions for people he loved instead of with them. He confused love with control. Aurora studied his face, searching for any hint of the old arrogance. The need to be right that had sometimes made their early relationship feel like a power struggle. She found only honesty and a vulnerability that was entirely new. How do I know you won't run again the next time something scares you? Because running almost cost me everything that matters. Dorian stood up suddenly, moving to the mantelpiece where their wedding photo still sat. Though Aurora had turned it face down months ago, he picked it up, studying the image of them dancing at their reception. Young and certain that love would be enough to conquer anything. Do you remember what you said in your wedding vows? He asked. Aurora's throat tightened. Dorian, you said that marriage wasn't about finding someone you could live with, but finding someone you couldn't live without. He turned to face her, the photo still in his hands. You were right. I can't live without you, Aurora. I tried. For 10 months, I tried to convince myself that loving you meant letting you go, but all I did was break both our hearts and deprive our son of his father. You were sick, Aurora said quietly. You were scared and facing something that could have killed you. I understand why you. No. Dorian's voice was firm but gentle. Don't make excuses for me, Aurora. I made a choice based on fear and pride, and that choice was wrong. The only question now is whether you're willing to let me spend the rest of my life making it right. Aurora set down her tea with trembling hands. The conversation she'd been avoiding was happening whether she felt ready or not, and every word Dorian spoke seemed to chip away at the walls she'd built around her heart. I'm terrified, she whispered. Of what? Of trusting you again and having you leave. Of believing that we can go back to what we were and discovering that too much has changed. She looked up at him, with eyes bright with unshed tears of letting Gabriel get attached to having his father around and then having to explain why Daddy isn't coming home anymore. Dorian moved toward her then, crossing the careful distance he'd maintained for months. He knelt beside the sofa, close enough to touch, but still giving her space to pull away if she needed to. We can't go back to what we were, he said softly. That couple was naive about how hard life could get, but maybe we can build something better, something stronger, something that can survive the kinds of storms that broke us the first time. Aurora looked down at him, this man who had once commanded boardrooms and now spent his evenings reading bedtime stories, who had once made unilateral decisions, and now asked for her input on everything from Gabriel's feeding schedule to his own business meetings. I love you, she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. I never stopped loving you. Even when I hated you, even when I was sure I'd never trust you again. But love wasn't enough the first time. Dorian, how do I know it will be enough now? Dorian reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. Because this time, we know what it costs to lose each other. This time, we know that the biggest risk isn't being vulnerable. It's trying to protect ourselves from vulnerability and destroying everything in the process. In the quiet of their living room, with their son sleeping safely upstairs and the weight of months of separation finally beginning to lift. Aurora found herself looking into the face of the man she'd married and seeing not just who he'd been, but who he could become, who he'd already started to become. If we do this, she said slowly, if we try to rebuild our marriage, it has to be different. No more unilateral decisions. No more protecting me from things you think I can't handle. We face everything together, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary. Dorian agreed. Aurora took a shaky breath, feeling as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no way to know if there was solid ground below. But maybe, she thought, the point wasn't knowing where you'd land. Maybe the point was trusting the person jumping with you. Okay, she whispered. Okay, let's try. Let's see if we can build something that won't break the next time life gets difficult. Dorian's face transformed with a hope so profound it took Aurora's breath away. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of their youth, but with the deeper tenderness of two people who had learned what it meant to lose each other, and were determined never to let it happen again. When they broke apart, Aurora rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing carefully in the space between what they'd lost and what they might still be able to build together. 6 months had passed since that pivotal evening when Aurora and Dorian had decided to rebuild their marriage from its broken foundation. Gabriel was now 10 months old, crawling with determined enthusiasm throughout the brownstone and pulling himself up on furniture with the fearless confidence that made both parents simultaneously proud and terrified. Dorian had officially moved back home 3 months ago, but they'd approached their reunion with the careful deliberation of architects, designing a building meant to withstand earthquakes. Separate bedrooms at first, shared meals and parenting duties, long conversations that stretched into the night as they learned to trust each other again with their fears, their hopes, their daily frustrations, and small victories. Tonight, Aurora sat in their bedroom again as of 2 weeks ago, watching Dorian pack for what should have been a routine business trip to Seattle. But nothing felt routine about the way her stomach clenched with familiar anxiety as she watched him fold shirts with military precision. "It's just 3 days," Dorian said without looking up from his suitcase, though his voice carried the careful tone he used when he sensed her emotional weather changing. "Tuesday through Thursday. I'll be back before Gabriel's bedtime on Thursday night." Aurora nodded, hating the irrational fear that crawled up her throat every time he prepared to leave. They discussed this trip for weeks. She'd even helped him plan the presentation he'd be giving to potential investors. But watching him pack still triggered memories of another suitcase, another departure that had lasted 10 devastating months. "I know," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "It's important for the company. The Seattle expansion could triple your market share in the Pacific Northwest." Dorian finally looked up at her, reading the tension in her posture despite her controlled words. He set down the shirt he'd been folding and moved to sit beside her on the bed, his movements slow and deliberate. "Aura, talk to me. What's really going on?" She wanted to brush off his concern, to pretend that her anxiety was manageable. But they'd promised each other radical honesty in this new version of their marriage. "I know it's illogical," she began, staring at her hands. "I know this is just business, and I know you're coming back. But watching you pack," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, "brings back memories of the last time I packed." Dorian finished gently. Aurora nodded, feeling foolish, but unable to shake the tight feeling in her chest. Dorian reached for her hands, his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "What can I do to help? What do you need from me?" The question itself was evidence of how much he'd changed. The old Dorian would have dismissed her fears as irrational, would have pointed out the obvious differences between then and now. This, Dorian asked what she needed, and waited for her answer. "I don't know," Aurora admitted. "It's not about you. It's about me. I thought I'd worked through this, but apparently my brain hasn't gotten the memo that you're not leaving forever. Then let's figure it out together." Dorian's voice was patient, free of the frustration she'd half expected. "What would help? Do you want to come with me? I could arrange childcare for Gabriel. Make it a family trip." "No." Aurora shook her head quickly. "I have the Morrison custody hearing on Wednesday. I can't leave." "Then what?" "Phone calls. Video chats. I could call every few hours." "Dorian." Aurora looked up at him, seeing the genuine concern in his gray eyes. "You don't have to manage my anxiety for me. I just need to work through it. But I want to help. If there's something I can do to make this easier." Aurora felt tears threaten, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of gratitude for this man who had learned to lead with compassion instead of solutions. who offered support without trying to fix what wasn't his to repair. "Just come back," she whispered. "That's all I need. Just keep your promise and come home to us, Aurora." Dorian's voice was fierce with certainty. "I will always come home to you, even if the plane is delayed, even if the meetings run long, even if Seattle falls into the ocean. I will always find my way back to you and Gabriel." Before Aurora could respond, the baby monitor on their nightstand crackled with the sound of Gabriel stirring in his crib. His sleep schedule had been erratic lately, a combination of teething and the cognitive leaps that his pediatrician assured them were normal but exhausting. "I'll get him," Dorian said, but Aurora was already standing. "Let me, I could use the distraction." They found Gabriel standing in his crib, gripping the rails with both hands and bouncing slightly on his feet. His face lit up when he saw them, a gummy smile spreading across his features despite the fact that it was nearly midnight. "Someone's not tired," Aurora observed, lifting Gabriel from the crib. He immediately began babbling in the musical nonsense language he'd recently discovered, his chubby hands patting her cheeks with delighted enthusiasm. "Da," Gabriel announced suddenly, his eyes focused on Dorian with unmistakable intent. Both parents froze. Gabriel had been making various sounds for weeks, but this was different, deliberate, directed. "Did he just?" Aurora began. "Da," Gabriel repeated, reaching his arms toward Dorian with the universal gesture of a child who wanted to be held. Dorian's face transformed with wonder and disbelief. "He said dada. He actually said dada." Aurora felt her throat tighten with emotion as she transferred Gabriel to Dorian's arms. Their son immediately settled against his father's chest, continuing his babbled commentary while patting Dorian's face with the same affectionate enthusiasm he'd shown her. "Da da da da," Gabriel said again, as if testing the sound and finding it satisfactory. "That's right, buddy," Dorian said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your daughter, and I'm never going to leave you again." The promise was spoken to Gabriel, but Aurora heard it as clearly as if it had been directed at her. Watching Dorian hold their son, seeing the absolute devotion in his face, feeling the solid presence of the family they'd rebuilt from ashes, Aurora felt her anxiety finally begin to loosen its grip on her chest. "He's going to say Mama next," Dorian said confidently, bouncing Gabriel gently. "Aren't you, Gabriel? You're going to make sure Mama gets her turn." But Gabriel seemed quite satisfied with his new word, repeating it with increasing volume and enthusiasm until both parents were laughing despite the late hour. "We should put him back down," Aurora said eventually, though she was reluctant to end this perfect moment. "In a minute," Dorian said, still marveling at his son. "I just want to remember this," his first word, and it happened when we were all together. Aurora studied Dorian's face in the soft glow of the nursery nightlight, seeing not just the man who would leave for Seattle in the morning, but the father who had already proven he would move mountains to come home to his family, the husband who had learned that love meant staying, especially when staying was hard. "Go to Seattle," she said suddenly. "Build your empire. Expand the company. Conquer the Pacific Northwest." Dorian looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Aurora moved closer to him, close enough to touch Gabriel's hand where it rested on Dorian's shoulder. "Because I know you'll come home, and when you do, Gabriel and I will be here waiting." Dorian shifted Gabriel to one arm and used his free hand to cup Aurora's face, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "I love you," he said simply. "Both of you more than anything else in this world." "We love you too," Aurora replied, the words carrying the weight of forgiveness, trust, and a future built on the solid foundation of lessons learned through heartbreak. In the quiet of Gabriel's nursery, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd created together, Aurora finally understood that some things were worth the risk of believing in again. Some people were worth the terrifying leap of faith that trust required. And as Dorian kissed her forehead while their son babbled contentedly in his arms, Aurora knew with absolute certainty that this time they were going to make it. Not because love was easy, but because they'd finally learned that the strongest love was the kind that chose to stay and fight for each other, even when staying was the scariest thing in the world. Gabriel said one more time, as if offering his blessing on the future his parents were brave enough to build together. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the brownstones' renovated kitchen, casting golden light across the flour-dusted countertops. Where Aurora and almost 3-year-old Gabriel were attempting to make cookies, Gabriel stood on his step-stool, his dark hair, so much like his father's, falling into his eyes as he concentrated on stirring the bowl with more enthusiasm than technique. Mama Vanilla, Gabriel announced, holding up the empty vanilla bottle with the triumph of someone who had successfully completed a monumental task. That's right, baby, Aurora said, unable to suppress her smile at his pronunciation. We added vanilla. What comes next? Gabriel scrunched his face in the serious expression he'd inherited from Dorian, clearly thinking hard. Chocolate chips, Aurora confirmed, handing him the bag. But just a little bit, okay? We don't want them to overflow. The instruction was immediately ignored as Gabriel appended half the bag into the bowl, chocolate chips scattering across the counter and floor. Aurora laughed despite herself, thinking of how the old version of herself would have stressed about the mess, about getting everything perfect. This version of herself, older, wiser, softened by the kind of joy that came from surviving the worst and choosing to embrace the beautiful chaos of family life, simply grabbed a handful of the scattered chips and tossed them playfully at Gabriel. Mama, silly, Gabriel giggled, chocolate smeared across his cheek. The sound of the front door opening was followed by familiar footsteps and Dorian's voice calling out, "I'm home, and I brought reinforcements." Aurora heard multiple sets of footsteps, followed by the excited chatter of what sounded like several people. She wiped her hands on her apron, lifting Gabriel from his step stool just as Dorian appeared in the kitchen doorway, followed by Thomas and his wife Diana, along with Isabel and her new boyfriend Vincent. "Surprise," Dorian said with the grin that still made Aurora's heart skip beats. "I thought we could use some help with Gabriel's birthday party prep tomorrow." Gabriel launched himself from Aurora's arms toward Dorian, who caught him with practiced ease, despite the fact that their son had grown considerably in the past 2 years. Gabriel was tall for his age. Dr. Martinez predicted he'd easily reach 6 feet like his father. With Dorian's sharp intelligence and Aurora's stubborn determination. "Hey there, buddy," Dorian said, spinning Gabriel around until he shrieked with laughter. "Are you helping Mama make cookies?" "Made mess," Gabriel announced proudly, pointing at the chocolate chip disaster zone. "I can see that," Dorian said solemnly. "Very impressive mess-making skills." Aurora watched the interaction with the warm contentment that had become her default emotional state. The past 2 years hadn't been without challenges. Gabriel's terrible twos were living up to their reputation. Dorian's company had weathered a difficult merger, and Aurora had taken on a partnership track at her firm that demanded long hours and complex cases. But every challenge had been met together with the kind of partnership that could only come from 2 people who had learned the hard way what they could lose if they took each other for granted. "Aura, you look amazing," Diana said, embracing her friend carefully to avoid the flower handprints. "Pregnancy suits you." Aurora instinctively moved her hand to the small bump that was just beginning to show beneath her loose sweater. At 4 months pregnant, she was past the worst of the morning sickness, but not yet at the stage where strangers would notice. This pregnancy felt different from her first, anticipated rather than discovered, planned and celebrated rather than faced alone. "Thank you," Aurora said, glancing at Dorian over Gabriel's head. "We're excited. Gabriel's going to be a big brother." "Big brother," Gabriel repeated, though Aurora wasn't entirely sure he understood what that meant, beyond the fact that it was apparently something worth celebrating. Dorian had insisted on being present for every doctor's appointment this time, had researched pregnancy nutrition with the same intensity he once brought to hostile takeovers, and had already started reading parenting books about sibling dynamics. The contrast between this pregnancy and Gabriel's couldn't have been more stark, and Aurora found herself grateful every day for the man Dorian had become. "When are you due?" Isabel asked, settling onto one of the kitchen stools. "Early September," Aurora replied. "Dr. Martinez says everything looks perfect. Strong heartbeat, good growth measurements." "Do you know what you're having?" Thomas asked, accepting the buyer Dorian handed him. Aurora and Dorian exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of learning to truly see each other. "A girl," Dorian said softly, his voice carrying a wonder that made Aurora's heart flutter. "We're having a daughter." The announcement was met with cheers and congratulations, but Aurora found herself watching Dorian's face, remembering the moment 3 weeks ago when the ultrasound technician had confirmed what they'd both secretly hoped for. Dorian had cried, actually cried, right there in the doctor's office, overwhelmed by the thought of having a daughter to protect and cherish and teach about her own strength. "What are you going to name her?" Diana asked. "Hope," Aurora said immediately. The name had come to them both without discussion, perfect in its simplicity and meaning. Hope, Elizabeth Hayes. Hope, Isabel repeated softly. That's beautiful. As their friends settled into the comfortable chaos of family dinner preparation, Aurora found herself standing at the kitchen island watching Dorian help Gabriel wash chocolate off his hands while simultaneously coordinating with Thomas about tomorrow's party plans. Their daughter moved gently beneath her hand, a reminder of the new life they were creating together. Not just the baby, but the family, the marriage, the future they were building. One deliberate choice at a time. Dorian caught her watching him and crossed to her side, his arms sliding around her waist with the natural ease of a man who no longer had to ask permission to touch his wife. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. The billionaire left to protect his wife but returned and found her in hospital, holding their baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Hayes Medical Technologies' executive suite. Dorian Hayes stood motionless at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his broad shoulders tense beneath his charcoal Tom Ford suit. At 39, he commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. 6'2" with an athletic build maintained through early morning runs and weekend tennis matches, his dark hair, perfectly styled, with just a hint of silver at the temples, caught the light as he turned his head slightly. Steel gray eyes, usually sharp with business acumen, now held a distant, troubled expression. The medical report lay open on his mahogany desk, its clinical language stark against the warm wood grain. Stage 2 lymphoma. The words seemed to pulse on the page, each letter a small betrayal of the body he'd always trusted to carry him through 18-hour workdays and demanding business negotiations. "Mr. Hayes," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Professional and concerned, Mrs. Hayes called again. "She said dinner is at 7 o'clock, and she's making that salmon dish you love." Dorian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Aurora, his wife of 3 years, with her infectious laugh and the way she wrinkled her nose when she concentrated on her legal briefs. The successful attorney who had built her own practice from scratch, who believed in fighting for justice with the same passion she brought to everything else in her life. The woman who still looked at him like he hung the moon, even after all these years. "Tell her I'll be late," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Important client call. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did have a call scheduled with Dr. Weyer in Munich, the oncologist whose experimental treatment program offered hope that traditional therapies in the States couldn't match, the treatment that would require months away from everything he'd built, everything he loved. He thought of the conversation they'd had just last weekend, lying in their king-size bed in their Beacon Hill brownstone. Aurora's auburn hair spread across his chest like silk. She'd talked about the nursery they'd designed together, her green eyes bright with dreams of cribs and midnight feedings. "I can already picture little feet running down our hallway," she'd whispered, tracing patterns on his skin with her fingertip. The memory felt like a physical blow now. How could he tell her that those dreams might crumble, that he might not be there to see those little feet, to teach their children to ride bikes or walk them down the aisle someday? How could he watch the light dim in her eyes as his own body betrayed them both? Dr. Harrison's words echoed in his mind from that morning's appointment with aggressive treatment. "Your prognosis is excellent, but I won't lie to you. It's going to be a fight. You'll need all the support you can get." Support, the word tasted bitter. Dorian had built his empire by protecting what mattered most to him. He'd sheltered Aurora from the ugliness of hostile takeovers, from the pressure that came with being married to a billionaire, from every hardship he could possibly shield her from. The idea of asking her to watch him suffer, to see him weak and vulnerable, to risk her own dreams for his uncertain future. It felt like the cruelest form of selfishness. His phone buzzed with a text from Aurora. "Missing you already. Can't wait to hear about your day over dinner. Love you endlessly." The message was accompanied by a photo she'd taken that morning. Herself, in their kitchen wearing his MIT t-shirt that hung loose on her petite frame, coffee mug in hand, sunlight streaming through the windows behind her. Her smile was radiant, unguarded, full of the future she believed they'd shared together. Dorian set the phone down with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. A plan was already forming in his mind, each step calculated with the same precision he brought to billion-dollar acquisitions. If he could beat this thing in Germany, really beat it, he could come back to her whole, healthy, ready to give her everything she deserved. And if he couldn't, well, At least she'd be free to build the life she'd always dreamed of, without the shadow of his illness hanging over her happiness. He picked up his phone and dialed Dr. Weber's number. When the familiar German accent answered, Dorian's voice was resolute. "Doctor, I'm ready to begin treatment. How soon can you have me in Munich?" As arrangements were made and timelines discussed, Dorian's gaze drifted to the framed photo on his desk. Their wedding day, Aurora laughing as he dipped her during their first dance, her white dress flowing around them like captured starlight. Neither of them could have imagined that love would one day require such an impossible sacrifice. He would leave her everything: the house, the accounts, the security she'd never have to worry about again. He'd craft a lie that would hurt her now, but save her from years of potential heartbreak. It was, he told himself, the most loving thing he could do. But as the call ended and silence settled over his office once more, Dorian Hayes, the man who had conquered every challenge the business world could throw at him, felt something he'd never experienced before: the devastating weight of a decision that might destroy the very thing he was trying to protect. What he didn't know was that life had already planted its own surprise, growing quietly within the woman he was preparing to leave behind. A secret that would change everything, even if he wouldn't discover it for months to come. What would you have done in Dorian's position? Told the truth or tried to protect the person you love most? Aurora Castellano Hayes sat at the kitchen island of their Beacon Hill brownstone, her laptop open to a complex contract negotiation, but her attention kept drifting to the untouched salmon dinner growing cold on the marble countertop. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the house like a countdown to something she couldn't name. At 28, Aurora possessed the kind of beauty that commanded attention without trying: porcelain skin that flushed easily when she laughed, long auburn hair that caught light like autumn leaves, and emerald eyes that could dissect a legal argument as easily as they could melt Dorian's defenses. Tonight, those eyes held worry as she traced the rim of her wineglass with one manicured finger, the deep burgundy liquid untouched. Her phone buzzed, finally, but instead of Dorian's name, it was her law partner, Isabel. Still at the office, Isabel's voice carried concern. "You've been working insane hours lately, just waiting for Dorian," Aurora replied, closing her laptop with a soft snap. Another late night for him. Big client call with Germany. Apparently, there was a pause. "Aura, you sound tired. When's the last time you two had a real conversation?" The question hit deeper than intended. Aurora thought of the past few weeks, Dorian's distracted silences during dinner, the way he'd started taking calls in his study with the door closed, the subtle but persistent distance she'd attributed to work stress. "We're fine," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. "Just busy season." After hanging up, Aurora padded upstairs to their master suite, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. The room was exactly as she'd left it that morning: Egyptian cotton sheets still rumpled from sleep, Dorian's cologne lingering in the air, his coffee cup forgotten on the nightstand next to a stack of medical journals she'd assumed were for his company's latest software development. She picked up one of the journals, flipping through pages of oncological research and treatment protocols. Strange reading for a software mogul, but Dorian had always been thorough in understanding the medical field his technology served. The sound of his key in the front door sent relief flooding through her. She hurried downstairs, finding him in the foyer, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. His tie hung loose, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "Hey," she said softly, approaching him with the smile that had first caught his attention at a charity gala 3 years ago. "Rough day." Dorian's steel-gray eyes met hers for a moment before looking away. Something like that. His voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. Distant and carefully controlled, Aurora reached up to straighten his tie, a gesture as natural as breathing after 3 years of marriage. But Dorian stepped back slightly. The movement so subtle she might have imagined it if not for the cold space it created between them. "I saved you dinner," she offered, searching his face for clues to the stranger standing in their foyer. "Your favorite. Thought we could eat together and you could tell me about this German client that's keeping you so busy." "I'm not hungry." The words came out sharper than intended, and she saw him wessy at his own tone. "Sorry, it's been a long day." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Aurora felt something shifting, like the moment before an earthquake, when birds fall silent and the air itself seems to hold its breath. "Dorian, what's going on?" She kept her voice gentle. "You've been different lately, distant. If there's something wrong, nothing's wrong." The lie came too quickly, too rehearsed. just business pressures. You know how it is.